Hey everybody, hi Dunley Dolphins, welcome back to the Dark Hills Divide. We are going to be in chapter 14 today. If you remember from last time, Alexa had one final task to do before she could get to the Forest Council. She had to crawl through this tunnel and see something that Darius wanted her to see. And it was some convicts that were talking about some kind of plan that they had. We're not really sure what it is yet. But now that she's seen that, they're on their way to the Forest Council. Now, chapter 14 is pretty long, so I'm going to break it up into two parts. So there's going to be a chapter 14 part 1 and chapter 14 part 2. All right, let's get started. Chapter 14, the Forest Council. It took me half as long to get out of the tunnel as it had taken me to crawl all the way in. The trip out was much harder on my body as I bumped my elbows and knees and back in a race for the exit. When I emerged from the hole, the light and heat hit me full force, and it took me several seconds to see anything but sheets of flaming white and yellow. I was exhausted and lay on my back, hands over my eyes, listening to the wind rush through the leaves on the trees. "You must be hungry. How about we open up this bag of yours and have something to eat?" It was Darius. He stood a few feet away. I rolled over onto my side and looked at him through narrowed eyes. "What are those men doing down there?" I asked. I even saw one of them up close. He had a C branded on his forehead. "I thought all the convicts who built the walls were gone. How can they still be here?" I said. "Oh, I know what they're doing down there. So will you shortly. But first, some lunch, shall we?" I tried to question him further, but he wouldn't budge. Finally, I gave him some dried meat, which he ate in a flash of teeth and slaver. I chomped indifferently on the bread as we walked, slowly making our way back into the direction of the Turlock wall that divided the mountains from the forest. I kept asking Darius about the men I had seen, but he seemed content to continue on quietly, winding his way through the thick underbrush and around the occasional fallen tree. Finally, in frustration, I yelled at him, "Can you just stop for a minute and tell me something?" Darius did stop, turning back at me. "I am responsible for two things today, getting you down that hole and having you in Malcolm's capable hands by midday. So far, I've accomplished only one of those tasks. All of your questions will be answered before the sun sets tonight, but for now I can't tell you anything more." He turned and started walking again, and though I felt completely exasperated, I followed, trailing a few feet behind him down the path. It was a long, hot journey, but at midday we were standing in a grove of cottonwood trees 50 yards from the Turlock wall. The gate to Bridewell was now safely in the distance, and looking overhead I could see that several hawks were patrolling the area from above, dodging a storm of white floating stuff from the trees. As I stood catching my breath with Darius, I saw rustling under the brush at a distance, a zing of gray, and then more rustling. "Ah, here he comes. Not much good for sleuthing, but a nice fellow still the same," said Darius. We watched as the formless gray ball of fur continued to weave in and out of view. After a while, it became clear that it was a rabbit, darting toward us between hiding places in the undergrowth. It was taking quite a long time for him to find his way to us. "Will you please stop the secret spy routine and get over here?" Darius cried. "You'll make us all late." For a moment, there was no movement at all. "Is that you, Darius?" came a tiny, uncertain voice from somewhere in the thicket. "Yes, it's me, the big wolf, come to eat the helpless bunny. The longer you take getting over here, the hungrier I get," said Darius. A gray head topped with floppy ears popped up about 20 yards away. "Coming," said the rabbit with great exuberance, and he was standing at my feet a few seconds later. "No need to get hostile," chided the rabbit, who I took to be Malcolm. "Ah, but I see you've got the girl, and on time. Nicely done." "All in a day's work for someone on his own," said Darius. He became quiet and looked at Malcolm with a terrible sadness. "Have you any word from Odessa and Sherwin?" "Stop your pouting. It's pathetic of a creature your size. This will all be over before you know it, Darius. Trust me," said Malcolm. "Now, how about a proper introduction?" Darius growled and then introduced me. Malcolm held out his foot in an effort to shake my hand. He said it was human custom to shake, and he wanted to make me feel at home. I bent down, took his furry gray foot between my thumb and forefinger, and awkwardly bobbed it up and down a few times. Malcolm chuckled nervously, and we both looked at Darius, who rolled his eyes. I laughed, and for the first time I felt a little less like a guest outside the wall, and a little more like these might actually be my friends. Darius and Malcolm huddled together and talked while I relieved myself behind a tree. This produced a whole new conversation about when to go to the bathroom, where to go to the bathroom, and whether or not one should cover it up when finished. After several minutes of arguing, Darius said, "I suggest we continue this conversation when we have more time, though I will concede Malcolm's views on marking trees over rocks makes a more compelling argument." Malcolm looked up at me, and I nodded my readiness to move on. "I'll go straight to see Yipes and tell him—" Oh, sorry, wrong voice. "I'll go straight to see Yipes and tell him of our progress. He'll be pleased to hear that you've come this far," said Darius. Then, with a slight bow of his head, he added, "Malcolm, always a great pleasure. Take care of our girl now and tell everyone I'm doing fine." Then he walked off and I was left with nothing to protect me but a small, smiling ball of fur with poor scouting skills. I felt suddenly alone and missed my father and friends back in Bridewell. I think I even missed Purvis, or at least the morbid comfort of his rude behavior. "You've grown from what I was told about your size. It must have been quite a squeeze getting down in that tunnel over Lathbury," said Malcolm. "The next one's not so bad." "The next one?" I said. "Sure, the next one. Didn't Darius tell you? We've got a big meeting over in the forest tonight. Lots to discuss." We walked, or should I say, I walked, and Malcolm hopped toward the Turlock wall. We arrived at an odd-looking hole surrounded by stones on all sides. It was slanted at an angle and looked as though it ran under the wall. "This is a strange-looking tunnel, Malcolm," I said. "That's because animals didn't make it. Humans did, and humans are always doing things in very strange ways. No offense to you, of course." He seemed flustered now that he'd said it, and he wished he could take it back. "No offense taken," I offered. "This is a culvert," Malcolm continued. "They appear every few miles along the walls. In the springtime, the water runs off the mountain, and then through these tunnels to Fenwick Forest and out into the dark hills, where it creates something of a marshland in the early months of spring." Malcolm went on to explain that the culverts were encased in stone, running down 5 feet under the huge stone blocks of the buried part of the wall, then gradually rising back up into Fenwick Forest and the dark hills. Malcolm easily fit inside. I followed and found that it was a very tight fit. I could move slowly forward on my belly, but the stone walls of the culvert were all around me, and it was rough going all the way. I continually grazed my shoulders and elbows along the walls. This tunnel descended faster, leveled out, and then began to rise again slowly, presumably on the other side of the wall. Pretty soon I saw light streaming down, and shortly after we were outside again in an open field. We were in Fenwick Forest. "Who are Odessa and Sherwin?" I asked, turning my head to the side, shaking dirt out of my hair. Malcolm didn't answer at first, but then he stopped hopping and looked at me. "Odessa is Darius's wife, and Sherwin is his son." I knew there had to be more to the story, and soon Malcolm was telling it. "Darius was off hunting for several weeks," he explained. "They put up the walls so fast, and there were so many humans about, he got caught on the mountainside. Like so many animals, he's far too big to fit through a culvert, and there's no way to dig deep enough to get under the buried part of the wall. He can't walk around the wall because both ends lead to jagged cliffs that drop off into the lonely sea. The water and walls keep them apart. He hasn't seen his family in quite some time." I thought a moment, trying to consider the consequences of what Malcolm had said. "Are there other stories like his?" I asked. He turned on the path and then began hopping again, his floppy back feet kicking up tiny storms of dust as he went. "More than a few," he said. We continued to make our way deeper into the woods. It was turning dark and cooling down. Fenwick Forest was vastly different from where I had just spent 2 days. The terrain around Mount Norwood had been far more open and arid, with tiny streams crisscrossing and connecting all over. 20 minutes into our walk away from the wall put us deep in a forest of fir, pine, cottonwood, and aspen trees. The lush forest floor was alive and danced with shadows cast from an endless parade of swaying trees. As we approached early evening, it was cool and peaceful. The sound of the trees moving in the wind high above seemed like a friendly traveling companion calling us farther and farther into the depths of the forest. As we walked, I kept thinking about the face, that suspicious man with the C on his forehead. How these men had escaped into the dark hills remained a biting question I couldn't get out of my mind. I began to have a creepy sense that we were being watched, and I started to hear what sounded like whispers all around me. I kept shaking cobwebs loose from my head, trying to refocus, but the strange whispering sound persisted, and I reasoned that it was the wind in the trees playing tricks on me. "Malcolm, do you hear anything strange?" I asked. Malcolm stopped and sniffed the air with his front legs up. "Oh, yes, we've got quite a procession going already. You're famous, Alexa. Every animal within 20 miles is hiding behind a bush or a tree limb trying to get a peek at you." Things were getting stranger all the time. We wound through the forest for another 5 minutes and then came to a stop where a trail split off in 2 directions, one straight ahead and one veering off to the left and down toward Lunenburg Wall. Both were covered by a thick canopy of low-hanging tree branches. "It looks like we've arrived, Alexa. Go on now, go straight ahead up that trail and don't stop until you see Ander." "What's an Ander?" I asked. "You mean, who is Ander?" chortled Malcolm. "Go on, then. You'll get all your questions answered once you reach the end of the path." I did as I was told, too tired to complain or argue with a rabbit. A few minutes later, the path widened into a circular area about 40 feet wide, bordered by large rocks and dead tree trunks. The rocks and trees were covered with animals, more animals than I had ever seen before. Squirrels, rabbits, mountain lions, bears, wolves, beavers, badgers, porcupines, skunks, and a smattering of wildlife I could not identify from my own limited knowledge. It was a frightening sight, made worse by the swarm of whispering I continued to hear buzzing in my head. Straight ahead, right up the middle of all the animals, was a ferocious-looking grizzly bear. Its head was like a boulder on its massive shoulders, and it swayed back and forth as the beast walked toward me. The whispering stopped. I was about to turn and run for my life when I spotted Yipes sitting on a rock to my right. I was so happy to see him I couldn't keep the big smile off my worn-out face. I read his lips as he mouthed the words, "It's okay, stay calm." The grizzly stopped so close in front of me that its wet nostrils sent a gentle wind through my hair. I looked down and saw where its enormous paws smashed the mossy green grass at my feet. It stood on 4 legs, its head a foot above my own. I knew from what I had read about grizzly bears that one quick swipe from its paw would break my bones and shred my skin. I remained perfectly still, breathing in and out in choppy waves. "We have waited for you a long, long time, my dear," said the grizzly. His voice was deep and sorrowful and slow in my head. He seemed old, though I had no idea how old by the looks of him. "I am Ander, the Forest King, and I have a lot to tell you." "Bring the food," he commanded, and a parade of animals came out of the woods with offerings of nuts, fruits, and fresh water. "Now let's sit down and have a nice long chat, shall we, Alexa?" We walked to the center of the grove and sat down. I drank until I thought I would throw up, and then I pulled some leftover meat out of my bag to eat with the nuts and fruit. "If you don't mind, Alexa, could you get by without the meat for now? Mixed company, you know. It sets them off." Ander looked around at all the animals. They were all staring at me with wide eyes, and some of the large animals were dripping saliva and acting strange. I put my food away and began eating a pear, which suited me fine. Ander proceeded to introduce me to a number of important animals in attendance. I met Murphy, a lively squirrel who kept zipping back and forth and twirling around in circles after his name was called. It took him a while to get calmed down, and he continued doing backflips and whirling spins every time Ander introduced another animal. There was Beaker, a raccoon. Ander said he was scientific for a coon, a problem solver. A badger named Henry was complimented on his fierce fighting skills. Picardy was a beautiful female black bear who had not seen her mate in a very long time. He had been off in the mountains looking for a den when the wall came rising into existence. I met Boone, a crafty bobcat who often came up with outlandish ideas that for some unknown reason actually worked most of the time. There was a quick and sneaky fox named Raymond and a nervous woodchuck named Vesper. Chopper and Whip were an agreeable pair of buck-toothed beavers. The sun was beginning to set, and I was getting cold. It must have shown because Ander took a break from his introductions to call Yipes over, who presented me with a blanket out of his pack. I draped it around my shoulders and curled my legs up to my chest, wrapping my arms around my knees. Soon it would be night, but for now, dusk coated the grove with a soft blend of velvety gold and green. It was heavenly. Ander finished the introductions with Odessa and Sherwin, the wife and son of Darius. Sherwin approached me cautiously, swaying his head back and forth. He was every bit the powerful beast his father was, but his features were more juvenile, and his coat was a lighter shade of gray. "You've met my father?" he questioned me. "Yes, I've met Darius. He's impressive," I said. I felt a wave of compassion for Sherwin, wondering what it must be like to lose your father in such an unjust way. I added, "When did you last see him?" "I don't remember ever seeing him. I was only a few months old when he was caught behind the wall, and by the time I was old enough to travel through the culvert, I was already too large. I probably could have done it as a child, but I was too afraid. When I was smaller, I thought many times about sneaking under to find him, but I never did. Now I'm so big I can barely get my head in the tunnel." He paused and looked off toward the Turlock wall in the distance. "At night, my father howls at me, and I howl back at him. We dream of hunting together, of he and my mother being side by side again. He often sounds sad, and in recent times, even a little old, like the long, lonely nights are beginning to wear on him. Sometimes he howls at me and my mother for hours and hours until his voice is shredded and cracking. On those nights, I often go to the culvert and put my front paws in, imagining I'm small again. Then I look to the wall and beat my head against the same spot until the blood is oozing out of my fur and into my eyes. My story is not so different from what many of these animals here would tell you. Most of the large animals have lost a son or a daughter, a mate or close friend or a parent. Others feel the terrible loss of the mountains or the lush wild streams lined with fruit trees and blackberry patches. The smaller animals, the ones who can use the tunnels, have maintained a relatively normal life after the walls." "What makes you think dragging me out here will make any difference?" I said. "I'm only a child, and I command no special importance in Bridewell. I create more bad than good back there. Ask anyone." Sherwin looked down for a long moment, then straight into my eyes with a heartbreaking look on his face. "Then we clearly thought wrong, and we should send you back. You're small enough to use the tunnels, and you have the right breeding. Those things are true. What you lack is belief. If bringing down the wall would require you to fly, you must believe you can fly. Otherwise, when the decisive moment comes, you will surely discover you have no wings." He turned and walked back to stand at his mother's side. The whispers and the sun were both gone. The sounds of owls, crickets, and frogs blended together to form a thick soup of mystifying night music. The full moon rose out of the trees from the east, pouring a bucket of soft white into the grove. And again, I felt the discomforting loneliness that so often haunted me. "I see you've got quite a scratch there on your arm," said Ander, his deep voice jerking me out of my self-pity. "I do apologize. Domesticated animals can be rather pesky at times. That's not to say Sam and Pepper are bad cats. They've actually been helpful in our attempts to get you out here, but they can be, shall we say, spirited. Now then, I believe you have a stone in your possession, which I must now ask you to produce. That is, if you don't mind. It may be that you are not the person for the job at hand, even if I'm quite convinced that you are. In any case, the stone will tell us a lot about what your future holds." With all that was going on, I had completely forgotten about the stone hanging around my neck in the small leather pouch. I clutched it under the blanket, afraid at first to give it up. What if I never got it back? I wiggled open the string at the top and removed the stone. When I held it out to Ander, the feathery green glow illuminated the space between the two of us, and the crowd of animals let out a meandering collection of oohs and ahs. I set the stone down on a large flat rock that sat between us, and it continued to throb liquid green light like the steady time of a beating drum. Boom, boom, boom. "Beautiful, isn't it?" said Ander as he gazed at its strange throbbing radiance. Boom, boom, boom. "This entire area, including the forest, mountains, and hills, was at one time full of Elyon's enchantment. It was a marvelous place indeed. The stone you chose is what allows you to communicate with us, just as we communicate with one another. At one time, there were 6 stones like this in the pool. Yipes found the first, then another was taken, then the convicts came and took all but this one." He nodded toward the pulsating green mass sitting between us. "In these stones lies the answer to why Elyon created us, why he created this place, and where he's gone." Ander sat silent for a long time. His heavy breathing filled the air. It seemed as though he was searching for something in the silence he couldn't quite find, and then he came back to life again.
Unfortunately, we haven't the time to talk about all that right now, he said. Elyon is on the move. His plans are unfolding in this very age, and we shall all be witnesses to his triumphant return in the days to come. One thing I can tell you, someone known to you was responsible for bringing the stones here, but that is about all we have time for.
Thomas Warvold, I said, without the slightest hesitation.
An excellent guess. He is responsible for a great many things that in his death we are left to consider. But he did not bring the stones. They were placed in the pool by his wife, Rennie.
Andrew looked at the sky and sniffed at the air, then continued.
When things settle down, you can come and see me again, and I'll tell you all about the mysterious Warvolds. For now, we really must be getting on with things.
Okay, so a lot of interesting conversation happening between Alexa and Andrew. We've heard about this person, Elyon, and he's the creator of this world that they live in. And he's got plans, and he's going to be coming back. So there's plans kind of happening all around Alexa, and she's still working to figure out how they all matter to her and what her goal is with all of those plans. I'll see you tomorrow for Chapter 14, Part 2. Bye.